The night I saw him standing alone on his back steps, I had no idea I was about to make the biggest mistake of my life. He wasn't pacing. He wasn't on the phone. He was just standing there, arms crossed, staring at nothing, like he was trying to remember how he'd ended up in that exact spot. I watched him from my kitchen window for longer than I should have. Then he turned his head, and our eyes met across the space between our 2 yards. Neither of us said anything, but I knew, the way you just know sometimes, that something in him was breaking quietly. What I didn't know yet was that reaching out to him would eventually force me to look at something I'd spent years refusing to look at in my own marriage. My name is Marissa. I'm 39, and up until that night, I would have told you my marriage was fine. Not exciting, not passionate, but fine. My husband, Paul, and I had been married for 15 years. A paid-off car, a dog, a mortgage I could actually afford. On paper, we had it figured out. But there was a version of us that had quietly disappeared somewhere along the way. We still talked, just not about anything that mattered. Whose turn it was to call the plumber, whether we needed more coffee filters, what time his mother was coming for dinner, the kind of talking that fills a house without ever filling the distance in it. I used to tell myself this was just what happened to marriages that lasted, that the spark was supposed to fade. That comfort was a trade-off for love that stuck around. Then Eli moved in next door, 41, recently split from his wife, living alone in a house that still had unpacked boxes in the hallway 3 months later. At first, I hardly registered him. He left early for work, came home late, and spent his weekends fixing gutters and mowing a lawn that didn't really need it. He seemed like someone who had everything handled. I'd learn later how wrong first impressions can be. It was a Tuesday, close to 11 at night, when I noticed his porch light was still on. I was locking up the back door and happened to glance over. He was sitting on the steps, elbows on his knees, head down. He didn't move for a long time. I don't know what made me walk outside. Maybe it was the way he was sitting. I recognized that posture. I'd folded myself into it more nights than I wanted to admit. Eli. He looked up, startled, then almost laughed at himself. Sorry, didn't realize it was that late. It's fine. You okay? He glanced at the dark windows of his own house, like the answer was in there somewhere. Honestly, I don't really know what to do with the quiet anymore. I understood that sentence better than I wanted to. So instead of saying goodnight, I said, "You don't have to sit out here by yourself." He gave a small smile. That was where it started. At first, it really was just neighborly. A conversation over the shared fence while I watered the garden. A wave when he pulled into the driveway. Small talk that slowly stopped being small. He told me about his marriage ending, not the messy details, just the shape of it. I told him a little about mine. Nothing damning. Just enough that we both felt less alone saying it out loud. Somewhere in there, talking to him became the part of my day I looked forward to most. That should have worried me. Instead, I started noticing his porch light the way you notice a text you're waiting for. I told myself it was friendship. Technically it was, but there was a second thing underneath it that I didn't let myself name yet. One evening he asked, out of nowhere, "Are you happy?" I laughed it off. That's a weirdly direct question. Is it? You didn't really answer it. I didn't have anything ready to say back. Paul hadn't asked me that question in years. I'm not sure he'd asked it once since the wedding. That night I lay next to my husband while he slept, staring at the ceiling, wondering when exactly I'd started mistaking functional for happy, and whether I'd even notice a switch happen. Weeks went on like that. Nothing physical. No lines crossed you could point to and say, there, that's where it went wrong. Which somehow made it worse. Because an emotional drift doesn't leave marks. It just leaves distance, and distance is easy to explain away. Then came the Friday Paul forgot the date that mattered to me. Not our anniversary, but the day we'd first met, years before the wedding. A date only I seemed to still be keeping. I bought him something small. Nothing dramatic, just a gesture. He walked in late, dropped his bag by the door, and asked what for dinner. I put the gift back in the drawer, without a word. He never noticed it was missing. I went outside. Eli was on his porch. He took one look at my face and asked what was wrong. Nothing, I said, which was a lie we both heard. He didn't push. He just slid over and made room on the step. I sat, and the tears came before I could stop them. Not loud, just there. He handed me the sleeve of napkins from his coffee. "Marissa, talk to me." "I'm okay." "You're really not." That was the moment I understood how dangerous it is to be truly listened to. You don't always fall for someone's face. Sometimes you fall for the way your name sounds in their mouth when they actually mean it. "You deserve to be someone's whole attention," he said quietly. "Don't." "Why not?" "Because I might start believing you." He didn't answer that. He just said, "Maybe you should." I stood up and walked home without touching him. No kiss. Nothing anyone could photograph as evidence. But something had shifted, and I knew it the second I stepped back into my own kitchen and looked at my husband like a stranger I used to know very well. Not because he'd gotten worse. Because I'd finally let myself see how much space had grown between us. The next morning, Paul noticed I was quiet and asked why. I almost told him everything right there. Instead, I asked, "Do you still love me?" He looked genuinely thrown by the question. "Of course I do." "Then why can't I feel it anymore?" He didn't have an answer, and that silence said more than a paragraph would have. That was the start of the first honest conversation we'd had in years. Not gentle, not romantic. There was anger in it, and old grievances neither of us had said out loud before. Paul admitted he'd felt the distance too, and hadn't known how to close it. I admitted I'd been getting attached to someone else. That sentence cost me more than any other I've ever said. "Eli," Paul said. Not a question. I nodded. He closed his eyes, and for a long stretch, neither of us spoke. I braced for him to yell. Instead, he said something that undid me more than yelling would have. "I knew someone would eventually notice you, since I stopped doing it." I cried harder at that than I had all week, because it meant he'd seen the gap too. He just hadn't known how to climb back across it. That night, I told Eli everything plainly, no editing. He listened, then asked, "So what now?" I didn't have an answer. The version of this where he was a rescue and I was a rescued had quietly stopped making sense. He wasn't a fantasy anymore. He was a real person with a real life. And I was a married woman with real consequences waiting on the other side of any decision I made. I could have left and gone to him. Part of me wanted to. But I realized something else. Underneath the wanting, I hadn't fallen for Eli specifically. I'd fallen for the version of myself that existed when someone finally paid attention to her. That distinction changed everything. I stepped back. Eli didn't fight it. He respected it, which somehow made it harder and easier at the same time. Paul and I started counseling. It didn't fix things overnight. There were still cold weeks. Nights on opposite sides of bed, technically together, still far apart. Moments I genuinely wondered if we'd been over for years before I let myself notice. But we were finally being honest with each other, and honesty, it turns out, is often more uncomfortable than a lie ever was. A few months later, Eli's job relocated him. We said goodbye in his driveway. No dramatic scene, no unfinished business whispered under the porch light. He hugged me once. "Thank you for reminding me I wasn't invisible," he said. "You did the same for me." I told him. Then he drove off, and I stood there watching his car disappear around the corner, waiting to feel abandoned. Instead, I felt something closer to awake. Here's what I understand now that I didn't then. Infidelity doesn't always start with a kiss. Sometimes it starts with a question your spouse stopped asking years ago. Sometimes it starts with being lonely enough to mistake being noticed for being destined. And sometimes the hardest choice isn't between two people at all. It's choosing to stop lying to yourself about which one you already were. Paul and I are still married. We're not who we were 15 years ago. We're more careful now, more deliberate about the small conversations we use to skip. Maybe that's what should have been there all along. I still think about Eli sometimes. Not with longing, with something closer to gratitude. He handed me back a version of myself I'd stopped checking on. I deserved to be seen. So did my husband. So I'll ask you the same thing I've had to ask myself. If you were standing where I was standing, what would you have done? Stayed in the quiet? Followed the feeling? Or fought for what was already yours, even after you stopped believing it was still there? Tell me honestly in the comments. And if this one hit close to home, like the video and subscribe. There's more where this came from. Because sometimes the hardest truth isn't that someone else caught your attention. It's realizing you quietly stopped listening to your own life.